Hello, this is Stu Powers. Today I'm going to show you how to colorize a sketch. Now this is a sketch that I did actually a while back, and it was just in grayscale. It was on some simple paper. Irrelevant to the fact, because what I took was the scan of it. I toned down the grays. I didn't want any blacks, and I printed it out onto Bristol paper, 100-pound smooth Bristol paper, and then used watercolors to actually colorize it. Now I could have used a light box and transferred it that way with light graphite, but considering it was somewhat intricate to save time, this is probably the fastest way to do it. The one thing you have to keep in mind is to keep that um, print light gray, dark enough to see, but not too dark because the ink is actually water soluble and it can muddy up your colors. So, and I trust me, I tried this a few different ways, and this is the one way that I like. So, first off, let's get into some time lapse. It does take a little bit of time in real life, and there's no reason to watch that. I think you can learn faster by jumping into time lapse, even though some people don't. I'll be right back. So the first thing that I do here is to wet down the background because I am just going to do a nice little blue tint across in the background and will help knock down the whites. Now, too much water, mind you, you can start seeing where some of your line work is going to start disappearing. I always keep a reference, and as you go, I will, as I get into it, I will refer back to it. Now, what I'm doing here is actually wetting it down a little bit more with it and coming back with a dry brush and cloth and picking out some of that blue. Okay, it's not going to be perfect, but what I don't want is a white trim around it. I don't want to have to paint in around everything. And considering that the light blue is very light, um, and the yellow is just a little bit darker in hue, I can get away with this. And this is why I'm also starting with light colors, doing the base value of Pooh Bear. And of course, everybody knows who this is. And this is a painting I actually did for one of my sons. I did this sketch for the older son years ago, and now I'm doing the colorized version for the younger one since he seems to appreciate color more. And it's for me, it works quite well working in the light colors and staying to one color first. In this case, I did the blues. Now I'm going to a little bit darker and I'm doing just the yellows. Um, and as that dries, because you don't want to do the next color right next to those colors until they dry, because they tendency to blend. Um, so here I've gone over to into the leaves, putting in the greens. And again, base values, getting some little bit of shapes here. Um, there's a little bit of a slant to my paper, to my canvas, so you can see where it has gravitated towards the tips of the leaves. And that's okay because it's supposed to be darker in the leaves than it is on our subject. And you can see where I'm not really staying to the lines, but I'm just getting an idea of this. So this is not a one for one. This is going in and painting in the shapes. Again, this is why I tend to use this half-inch angled brush because I get the tips in there and get really nice fine lines. I can actually get edges in there, and I can get some wide washes as well. Now here, again, I am going close in to our subject matter and then getting around and cleaning it up, the edges a little bit more. And you never try to, well, I can't say never, but normally you don't try to do watercolor in the first pass unless you're using a thick cover. But in most cases, when the water dries, it will be lighter. So we build them up. And in this case, you can still see some of my line work in the tree trunk as well. And that will give you an idea, a guide how to mold um, the tree trunk. as I go. It definitely does help. And another reason to do it this way as a through a printer and to print it out and then colorize it is it'll keep you, it'll definitely speed up the process, but it'll also keep you true to what your original drawing was. And this was actually, I think, other than the subject matter, of course, this is my representation of my composition. I've used the characters, of course, in the settings, very similar settings, and I came up with the other stuff based on the style. So this is definitely fan art in that sense. I adopted not just the character, but also the style, and a great way to learn, by the way. It takes the chances of failure out when you don't really have to worry about the composition too much. You don't have to worry about the design. All I'm worrying about, and I'm not even worrying about what I'm doing here, is concentrating on painting. Again, you can see where I'm going in here now with more of a dry brush technique to get a thicker paint cover and also get a thicker tone because you're not supposed to be seeing some through some of these um, leaves. And I'm not going to paint every leaf. I'm just putting in these um, leaf shapes. And that's kind of the way you want to do a lot of these things anyways. Now, I will remind you too is I am going to come back in here and do colored pencils. Colored pencils and watercolors work great together. Same with graphite as well. Graphite is a great, as long as you use H lead or HB. You don't want to go too dark because, but it does mix well with watercolors. Um, in this case, these were all transparent watercolors. There's no gouache involved. So you can get some pretty good coverage with it. And again, if you do want to get that thicker paint feel like you would with an oil or even with gouache, you can put it on thicker with very little water, maybe straight out of the tube, and not pans, but straight out of the tube, and you can put it down just the only moisture that's in the paint itself. And you can get some really nice textures that way. You can actually build up the surface in a 3D fashion because you're really actually creating a three-dimensional element now. Um, but back to our subject matter here. You can see where I know that my light source is coming from my upper right and it's coming through some branches and stuff, so it is somewhat diffused. But I am putting the darker side on the left-hand side. So my branch is darker over there. There's going to be a cast shadow, a bit of a cast shadow from Pooh Bear. And of course, the face is going to be darker as well. The shirt's going to be darker. There's going to be a darker darkness around the collar of the shirt due to it being on the left-hand side of our character. And of course, you want to add that line weight in those shadows to the bottom, like the shirt's coming up and over. You're going to have some of that. You're going to have it under the rim of the um, honey pot. I almost call it cookie pot. It's a honey pot, and also within the honey pot itself. And all I'm doing is I'm using the same color. This is not, you know, a color perfect. I am just using a darker version of that um, color, less water in this case. And you can see here now I'm into the pencils. And if I do want to come back in with colored, um, with the watercolors after the pencils, I can because these are non-water soluble. Though they do make colored pencils that are water colored pencils, and of course they are, as they would suggest, a water soluble. But these are not. These are Faber-Castells or the Prismacolors. Either one can work. So you can see where I'm just tightening up some edges, adding a little bit more detail, a little bit more, maybe correcting some areas where I might have overpainted some areas. I keep going back to that foot because that foot isn't just right. I eventually do get it fixed, but again, it's One other thing about this too, because it speeds up the process of taking that sketch to colorize it. If you don't colorize it the way you want to the first time, it's okay. Just print it out again and try it again. Print it out again, try it again. Next time, try it in gouache. Maybe you want to do it all in colored pencils. You can. Bristol paper, the smooth Bristol paper, is beautiful for the watercolors, gouache, colored pencils will take markers. It might absorb a little bit of your markers more so than some of like a marker paper or non-porous paper. Um, but I can come back in there with, I don't like to come back in with graphite over this because graphite has a tendency to be very shiny. I can get shiny spots with colored pencils as well, but graphite um, has a tendency to do that. So if it's underneath the watercolors will make it more of a matte finish, non-reflective surface. I really had a lot of fun with vines and organic things like this. It's very hard to go wrong. I mean, I just made up these styles of vines. I'm sure I took this from another, Disney movie. Probably my youngest son likes the Jungle Book books and movies, and this is something you probably see in there as well. And again, keeping some shadow towards the bottom of it makes it wrap. You know, that form value change equals form change. Something I'll say and have said many a times before, and it's something I keep in my head. I want shape, a little bit of detail, but you don't want to um, sit there and adding every bit of detail that you can, because we're not trying to do reality, especially in something like this, where we are trying to do a representation. I mean, this is a cartoon, so this is as far from reality as you can get. But trying to get make it look three-dimensional instead of two-dimensional is really the purpose of most of this. So again, you could actually sit here and noodle this, which I tend to do, um, adding a little here, a little there, stepping back from and seeing what it's missing. Maybe it's not dark enough, but the one thing I did like about my approach on this version, and I did do a couple of versions, is that background. The background was kind of hard to do, trying to paint around it. Um, I don't use a frisket. Some people do that. But in this case, a nice wash over it, nice and consistent wash, make up enough of the same color. And you can see how that um, sky back there was came out pretty even. Now, if I did this on like a hot press paper, I would see more texture in that paper because of the grain itself rises. It's cotton, and it's very nice, but not as smooth. It's more like a vellum feel to it. Definitely better than, or definitely smoother than a cold press watercolor paper. The pressed is, of course, like I said, cover is a cotton base. Most of them are 100%. You can get a few that are only 25%, but I go with the cotton ones. But they do tend to raise, and they can give you some nice textures if that's what you're doing. But considering this is a small painting, I go for smooth. If I want to go with large painting, and I could use hot press with no problem, and frankly, you wouldn't see a lot of the texture from the paper, just because when you view it digitally, once I take a picture of it and bring it in digitally, you're not going to see it. Um, it's too far away. That's kind of one of those digital tricks, is to paint it twice as large as you're going to present it, and it actually cleans up a lot of the brush strokes. So that's something to keep in mind too if you like to do a lot of digital work. Now you can see here where I was talking about the cast shadow earlier. I am actually using, this is actually using a brown pen. It's not using black, and that's one of those things is, shadows aren't all gray, aren't all black. they have a bit of the um, localized color as well as influence from the light sources itself. Of course, this being outside, you can think blue could be in there, quite quite understandable because you got that nice blue sky behind it. You can think yellow if it's directly from the sunlight, and it's a yellow light. It's These are the assumptions you make because we can't see what the sun is, and we can't see exactly what's going through. You could actually even do a green, the shadows could be a green hue to it because it's being diffused through the leaves above. In this case, I didn't. I stayed closer to the uh, localized color. Um, Keeping in mind too is you're also limited to the pencils you have. This case, this Faber-Castell I have is about a 36 count. You can go higher, but that's all I have. Um, if that's all I have, I have to work with what I have. So I might have to go in here with a couple different kinds of pencils just to build it up and knock it down into a blend. Same with your paints. That's why I do like watercolor because you really can do it with a limited palette, and you can make by mixing the greens and the blues and the yellows and the reds, you can make almost every color that you need. It's just nice to grab a tube with it already made. It speeds things up, and I really do like doing trees and leaves and things like that. So, well, hopefully you enjoyed this and had a lot of fun. Thank you for joining me. Have a good day.